Before we begin, if you value deep source-driven history that treats survival as a discipline rather than a hobby, subscribe to the Survival Record. This channel exists for viewers who want to understand not just what happened, but why it mattered, and how those lessons still apply. Most people think of World War II cold as a background hardship, an environmental detail overshadowed by tanks and tactics. What's often missed is that cold itself became a quiet but decisive force, shaping morale, operational readiness, and survival outcomes. In many theaters, soldiers and civilians weren't saved by official supply chains or standardized equipment, but by improvised heating systems built from scraps, ruins, and hard-earned knowledge. These weren't clever tricks. They were responses to systemic failure, lessons written in frozen ground and unheated rooms. What follows is not a catalogue of gadgets, but a record of human adaptation under pressure and why these overlooked systems still matter. Cold exposure forced armies to relearn basic truths about heat, shelter, and energy. Across Europe and Asia, militaries entered winter campaigns, assuming logistics would keep pace with movement. They rarely did. Fuel shortages, destroyed infrastructure, and overstretched supply lines meant that warmth became decentralized. Heating shifted from something issued to something constructed. This reality exposed a hard truth. In prolonged conflict, survival often depends on what people can build themselves, not what institutions promise. In German-occupied Eastern Europe, both civilians and soldiers scavenged brick, clay, and broken iron to build crude masonry stoves modeled on traditional peasant designs. These stoves were inefficient by industrial standards, but they exploited thermal mass. Once heated, they radiated warmth for hours. The lesson here is subtle but enduring. Slow heat retention can matter more than raw output when fuel is scarce. The Finnish military refined field heating because cold was treated as a tactical variable. Finland's experience during the Winter War forced rapid innovation. Official heaters were limited, so soldiers adapted civilian sauna principles into compact, transportable shelters heated by stone-lined fireboxes. These systems prioritized controlled airflow and insulation rather than constant flame. Heat was stored, not wasted. This approach influenced later cold weather doctrine by emphasizing that insulation and heat retention outperform continuous combustion. Modern survival shelters still rely on this principle, whether acknowledged or not. Soviet frontline units survived in part by burying their heat sources. Red Army soldiers on the Eastern Front frequently constructed zemlyankas. These were partially underground shelters, heated by low-profile stoves vented through concealed flues. These systems served two purposes: warmth and camouflage. Smoke was diffused through soil and snow, which, reduced visibility to enemy aircraft. The buried stove was a response to both cold and combat. It really demonstrated how survival systems must account for multiple threats simultaneously. Heat without concealment could be fatal. This balance remains relevant in modern survival planning, where visibility, energy use, and safety all intersect. In bombed cities like Warsaw, Leningrad, and Berlin, civilians repurposed collapsed basements and stairwells into shared heating spaces. Improvised rocket-style stoves were built from rubble and metal scraps, designed to burn almost anything combustible: wood, furniture, books, even coal dust. These systems were dangerous, but they reflected an understanding of airflow efficiency that actually predated modern survival stove design. The so-called rocket stove principles widely discussed today were not invented in peacetime labs. They emerged from necessity under siege conditions. Rail lines were strategic assets, and keeping them operational in winter required heated switching stations and worker shelters. When fuel deliveries failed, workers built oil-soaked wick heaters from scrap metal and used waste lubricants as fuel. These heaters were crude, but they highlight an often ignored aspect of wartime survival. Heat was infrastructure. Keeping a human warm often meant keeping a system alive. The same logic applies today in disaster preparedness, where protecting workers can be as critical as protecting equipment. Allied pilots shot down over occupied territory were trained to avoid visible fires. Many carried or constructed small alcohol or solid fuel heaters designed to warm hands and core temperature without producing smoke. These devices weren't about comfort. They were about preserving fine motor control and decision-making capacity. Cold degrades cognition before it kills. World War II survival training quietly acknowledged this, influencing post-war escape and evasion doctrine that still prioritizes small, controllable heat sources. In China and the Pacific Islands, Japanese troops often reverted to hibachi-style charcoal burners used in enclosed shelters. These were risky due to carbon monoxide, but they reflected cultural familiarity with compact indoor heating. The lesson here is not endorsement, but understanding. Familiar systems are more likely to be used correctly under stress. Survival planning that ignores cultural habits often fails in practice. Prisoners of war across Europe and Asia built tin can stoves, clay-lined burners, and shared heat pits using stolen fuel and scavenged materials. These systems were often dismantled daily to avoid punishment. Their significance lies in knowledge transmission. Techniques were taught, refined, and passed along quietly. Survival knowledge became social capital. This dynamic, where information matters more than tools, remains central to modern preparedness thinking. Field hospitals improvised heated floors and water-warmed bricks to prevent shock and hypothermia in wounded soldiers. These systems were often built from engine coolant or salvaged radiators. This reframed heat as a medical intervention. Modern trauma care still reflects this understanding. Maintaining body temperature is a prerequisite for survival, not a secondary concern. Resistance fighters in forests and mountains built low-smoke heating systems integrated into dugouts and caves. These allowed year-round habitation without revealing positions. The strategic implication is clear. Sustainable heat enables persistence. Without it, resistance movements collapse under environmental pressure before enemy action. The widespread reliance on do-it-yourself heating during World War II exposed institutional blind spots. Post-war militaries invested heavily in standardized cold-weather gear, insulated shelters, and portable heaters, not out of innovation, but embarrassment. Doctrine changed because people froze when they shouldn't have. Survival systems became formalized precisely because improvisation had carried too much of the burden. These forgotten heating systems matter because they reveal how survival actually works. They show that resilience is built from understanding physics, materials, and human limits, not from gadgets alone. They remind us that preparation is as much about knowledge as it is about stockpiles. Remembering these systems isn't nostalgia, it's acknowledgement. The people who built them weren't improvising for novelty. They were responding to failure, scarcity, and indifference. Their solutions still speak to anyone serious about preparedness today. If you value this kind of grounded historical analysis, subscribe to The Survival Record and share this video with others who care about understanding the overlooked mechanics of survival in history.